The dog sat at the train station, eyes fixed on the horizon. Seasons passed, faces changed, but he remained, faithful, unwavering. His owner was gone, but hope refused to die. And then, after 4 long years, something unimaginable happened. The station had long since become a part of him. Each morning, as the city awoke, he would take his place near the worn-out wooden bench, eyes scanning every face that passed. The routine was carved into his very soul, a ritual of devotion, an unbreakable tether to a promise made long ago. He was no longer the strong, playful pup that once bounded through the streets beside his master. His fur, once thick and golden, had dulled, matted by years of waiting in sun, rain, and snow. His ribs, once hidden beneath a healthy frame, now showed faintly beneath his coat. But his eyes remained unchanged, deep pools of unwavering faith, still filled with the longing of a creature who understood only one truth: loyalty. 4 years. 4 winters had come and gone, their frost creeping through the cobblestone streets, biting into his fragile frame. 4 summers had bathed the world in golden hues, their warmth never quite reaching the cold emptiness that had taken root inside him. He had watched the leaves turn and fall, watched the world move forward while he remained frozen in time. The people knew him now. Vendors left scraps of food beside the station steps. Children whispered his name, though he had none. To them, he was simply the waiting dog, a silent sentinel of love lost to time. He had become a story, a ghost of devotion etched into the rhythm of the city. But he was no ghost. He was alive, breathing, waiting. Because deep within him, untouched by the passage of time, was the echo of his master's last words. "I'll be back soon, boy. Just wait for me." And so, he waited. But waiting is a cruel thing. With each passing day, hope flickered, dimming ever so slightly. The world whispered to him that his master was gone, that he was waiting for a shadow. Yet, he stayed. Because if love was anything, it was relentless. And love was all he knew. On this day, as the sun bled into the horizon, streaking the sky with deep oranges and purples, something felt different. The air was thick with an electricity he could not name. The station was quieter than usual, the murmurs of the passing crowd a distant hum. Then, a scent. Faint, fragile, but unmistakable. His head snapped up, ears perked, heart pounding. It was impossible. Yet in the fading light, a figure stepped onto the platform. And for the first time in 4 years, the waiting dog's world tilted. The scent hit him like a distant memory pulling itself back into the present, fragile yet undeniable. His body tensed, his breath hitching as the figure stepped further into view. The world around him blurred, the churning wheels of passing carts, the muffled voices of strangers, the clatter of hurried footsteps. None of it mattered. All he saw was him. But could it really be? The man moved slowly, dragging a heavy suitcase behind him. His clothes were crisp, his face lined with the weight of years spent elsewhere. There was something different about him, an air of exhaustion, of a man who had seen too much, lost too much. The dog hesitated, ears twitching as doubt clawed at his heart. He had been wrong before, many times. Countless strangers had passed him with familiar scents, with fleeting similarities that had sent his heart racing, only for the cold truth to crush him moments later. But this scent, this was different. His legs trembled as he took a tentative step forward. The man stopped. For a moment, the world stood still. The past and the present collided in the narrowing space between them, years collapsing into seconds. The man's gaze swept over the crowd, unfocused, weary, until it landed on the small, frail form standing a few feet away. His breath caught. The dog's golden eyes locked onto his, searching, pleading. The man's suitcase slipped from his grasp, the dull thud swallowed by the weight of realization. It couldn't be. The last time he had seen those eyes, they were bright with youthful mischief, filled with life and boundless energy. The last time he had touched that fur, it had been thick and soft, untouched by the cruel passing of time. Yet here he was, aged, weathered, but still waiting. 1,000 thoughts rushed through the man's mind all at once. He had left for what was supposed to be a short trip, a business venture in a foreign land that had stretched into years of struggle, setbacks, and regret. He had meant to come back. He had wanted to. But life had other plans, and through it all, through 4 years of absence, of silence, of a home left abandoned, his dog had waited, his vision blurred. A lump rose in his throat. He opened his mouth to speak, to call out the name that had not passed his lips in so long. But he never got the chance. Because in the next instant, the dog was running, his frail body surging forward, paws pounding against the cobblestone, carrying him toward the only thing that had ever mattered. The man barely had time to react before the weight of love and unwavering devotion crashed into him, knocking the breath from his lungs. The waiting was over. He was home. The world around them faded into nothing. The dog buried his face into his master's coat, his frail body trembling from exhaustion, relief, and the sheer force of his own emotions. The man's arms instinctively wrapped around the creature he had thought lost to time, his grip tightening as if he were afraid that if he let go, the dog would vanish like a cruel mirage. A lump swelled in his throat as he pressed his face into the scruffy fur, now rougher and thinner than he remembered. He could feel every rib, every notch of bone beneath the dog's golden coat. Guilt wrapped itself around him like an iron chain. What had he done? A hand reached out, hesitant, before finally settling over the dog's head, fingers trembling as they traced over the years he had missed. He had spent so much time chasing his own ambitions, so much time lost in the whirlwind of his own mistakes, never imagining that someone had been waiting for him all this time. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm here, boy. I'm so sorry." But words were meaningless now. The dog didn't need apologies. He didn't need explanations. He only needed this: his master's presence, the scent that had haunted his dreams for years. For the first time in 4 long years, he allowed himself to believe. The sound of the station carried on around them. People slowed their steps, whispering among themselves as they watched the scene unfold. Some recognized the dog, the waiting dog, the legend of the station, and their eyes burned with emotion. A woman wiped at her eyes, whispering, "He waited all this time." A vendor, the same one who had left scraps for him every evening, shook his head, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. The man pulled away slightly, looking down at the fragile body in his arms. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a breath, though he already knew the answer. A passerby, a station guard, stepped forward, clearing his throat. 4 years, he said. 4 years, every single day. He never stopped waiting. The words punched into the man's chest like a physical blow. His heart clenched, his breath shaky as he looked back at the dog, who stared up at him with absolute trust, tail giving the faintest of wags. 4 years, 4 winters, 4 summers, 4 years spent in the cold, in the rain, in the merciless heat of the sun, because of him. A sharp pain lanced through his ribs, a wound carved deeper than any knife could cut. He wanted to take it back, to undo the years of loneliness and suffering, but time was cruel, and regret was the heaviest weight of all. "I should have come back," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The dog, of course, didn't care about should-haves or what-ifs. He had never resented his master. He had never questioned his absence. He had simply waited, because love, pure and untainted, had left no room for doubt. The station guard stepped closer, rubbing the back of his neck. "He got sick a few times," he admitted. "We tried to take him, to shelters, but he always found his way back here. No matter how far he was taken, he'd return. We all gave up trying to move him after a while. Figured he had to be waiting for someone." The man swallowed hard, his throat burning. The dog had been sick. He had suffered. And yet, through all of it, He had never given up. The station had been his home. This cold bench, the unforgiving streets, the scraps left by kind strangers. This had been his world. Tears burned behind the man's eyes, and he turned away for a moment, exhaling shakily. "Not anymore," he said, his voice firm now. He ran a hand through the dog's worn fur, determination settling into his bones. He would fix this. He had to fix this. Carefully, he scooped the dog into his arms, mindful of how light he had become. A collective hush fell over the station as he turned, stepping away from the place that had been both a sanctuary and a prison for this waiting soul. People watched in silence as the man carried his dog away, through the crowds, through the exit, taking him home at last. But the dog hesitated. His body tensed slightly in his master's arms, his ears flicking back as he looked over his shoulder. The station, the bench, the place where he had waited for so long. Even as his master carried him away, a part of him still didn't believe it was over. He had lived in a world of waiting, of uncertainty, for so long that he no longer knew how to exist outside of it. The station had been his home, not by choice, but by necessity. The unfamiliarity of being held, of being taken away, unsettled him. The man felt it, felt the small shudder in the frail body he carried. He looked down, saw the way the dog's head remained turned, eyes locked onto the station. The years of waiting had done something to him, something deeper than just hunger, just exhaustion. It had rewired him, made him a creature of habit, of patience, of quiet suffering. The man's heart clenched as he tightened his grip. "You don't have to wait anymore," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. The dog blinked, uncertain, but he didn't struggle, didn't fight. Instead, he allowed himself to rest his head against his master's chest, though his eyes remained half open, watching the station disappear behind them. As they reached the street, the man hailed a cab, his arms never loosening their hold. The driver's eyes widened as he saw the thin, frail dog curled against his passenger. "That the dog from the station?" he asked. The man hesitated, then nodded. The driver exhaled, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered, before motioning to the seat. "Get in. Let's get him home. Home." The word felt foreign now. For 4 years, home had been waiting. For the first time in his life, the dog didn't know what came next. But as his master whispered soft reassurances, fingers running gently through his fur, he allowed himself to believe, just a little, that maybe this was real. Maybe this time, waiting wasn't needed anymore. The cab pulled away from the station, carrying them toward something unknown, something new. And for the first time in 4 years, the dog closed his eyes, not to dream of the past, but to rest for the future. The cab rolled through the streets, the city's neon lights flashing against the rain-speckled windows. The man barely noticed them. His focus remained fixed on the frail creature curled in his lap, feeling the shallow rise and fall of the dog's ribs beneath his coat. It felt fragile, this moment, this reunion, like something that could be taken from him just as suddenly as it had been given. He kept one hand on the dog's back, fingertips brushing against the patches of rough fur, feeling the weight of time in every ridge of bone. The driver cast a glance through the rearview mirror. "You know, people talk about him like a legend," he said. "Some thought he was just a story, a ghost dog, waiting for someone who was never coming back." The man swallowed hard, his grip tightening. "I came back," he said, almost to himself. The driver nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," he murmured. "Guess you did." The rest of the ride passed in silence. When they pulled up to the man's apartment complex, he hesitated before stepping out. It felt wrong somehow, crossing the threshold of his home when his dog had spent so many years out in the cold. He shifted the weight in his arms, feeling the dog stir slightly at the change in movement. "Come on, boy," he whispered. The words felt unnatural now. He had spoken them so many times before, years ago, when they had meant something simpler. Come on, let's go for a walk. Come on, let's head home. But home had been lost to time, and the dog had been forced to build a new meaning for it. A station, a bench, a place where waiting had been all he had. Would he even recognize this as home anymore? The thought sent another wave of guilt crashing into him, but he pushed it aside and stepped into the warm glow of the building's lobby. The receptionist, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair, looked up from her desk. Her eyes widened. Oh my God. The man braced himself. He didn't know what reaction to expect. Judgment? Pity? Shock? But when she stood, her hand flew to her mouth, her expression softening. "That's him, isn't it?" she whispered. He nodded. Her gaze dropped to the dog, and something like disbelief passed over her face. "All this time, he waited for you." The man felt his throat tighten. He only nodded again, unable to find the words. She exhaled, shaking her head. "You take care of him now, you hear? That dog deserves everything." "I will," he promised, voice thick. "I swear I will." As he stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut, he felt the weight of her words settle deep into his chest. He deserves everything. The doors opened into his apartment, a space that had once felt expansive and modern, but now seemed sterile and unfamiliar. The dog stirred slightly in his arms, lifting his head with a faint, uncertain whimper. The man set him down gently on the wooden floor, crouching beside him. "This is home," he said softly. The dog didn't move. His paws remained firmly planted on the cold surface, his body still tensed, as if expecting the world to shift beneath him. He didn't understand this place. 4 years was a long time. Too long. The walls, the smells, the air. Everything was different. And waiting. Waiting was all he had known. His eyes flicked to the door, muscles twitching with instinct. This wasn't the station. This wasn't where he was supposed to be. He took a hesitant step back. The man saw it, the way his dog's body coiled with unease, with the urge to retreat to the only world he had known. Panic laced through him. "No," he whispered. "No, boy. You're home. You're home now." But how could he explain that to a creature who had spent years thinking otherwise? The dog let out a small, unsure whimper, eyes darting from the man to the door. His body understood survival in the only way it had been taught: the station, the streets, the waiting. Home was a promise that had never come back. The man swallowed, his own heartbeat thrumming in his ears. He needed to fix this. He needed to show him that the waiting was over. Slowly, he reached into the coat draped over the couch and pulled something from its pocket. A collar, the same one his dog had worn the day he left. Faded, a little worn, but still intact. He knelt before his dog, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember this?" The dog's ears flicked. His gaze settled on the collar, nostrils flaring slightly as he inhaled its scent. Something old, something familiar. The man swallowed hard, carefully extending his hand. A test. A bridge between the past and the present. For a moment, everything stood still. Then, hesitantly, the dog lowered his head. His nose brushed against the leather. Recognition flickered in his golden eyes. Not the station, not the waiting, but something older, something warmer. The man exhaled slowly, relief crashing through him like a wave. He gently slipped the collar around the dog's thin neck, fastening the buckle with careful fingers. The dog stood still, his body still taut with uncertainty, but his eyes never left his master's face. The man hesitated, then reached out and pressed a palm against the dog's head, fingers trailing through the rough fur. A pause. Then, a slow, quiet wag of the tail. Barely there, but real. A breath of belief, rekindled from the embers of something long lost. The man let out a soft laugh, pressing his forehead against the dog's. "We'll get there," he whispered. "I promise." That night, as the dog curled up on a blanket in the corner of the room, The man watched from a distance. He didn't force him onto the couch, didn't try to move him closer. The dog needed time, just as he did. He fell asleep with the sound of quiet breathing beside him, and for the first time in years, neither of them was alone. The waiting was finally over. But the healing had only just begun. The morning sun cast long, golden streaks across the apartment floor, but the light felt foreign, unfamiliar. The man stirred awake, his limbs stiff from sleeping on the couch instead of his bed. The first thing he did was turn his head toward the blanket in the corner of the room. The dog was still there, curled in on himself, his thin body barely rising with each breath. For a split second, panic shot through him. Was he even breathing? He scrambled up and rushed to his side, heart hammering. But as soon as he knelt down, the dog's ears flicked and his golden eyes cracked open. Relief flooded the man's chest. He exhaled, pressing a shaking hand over his face. "You scared me, boy," he murmured, running a hand over the dog's frail body. The dog barely reacted. He only blinked at his master, then turned his head toward the door. The man's stomach twisted. He was still waiting. Even now, in a warm apartment with his master beside him, the dog's instincts hadn't changed. His muscles were still tensed, ready to return to the station, to the only home he had come to know in these past 4 years. "Not there," the man said softly, his fingers tracing slow, soothing circles against the dog's fur. "You don't have to wait anymore." The dog let out a slow breath but remained still. The man forced a small smile. "Come on, let's get you something to eat." The dog had always been eager for breakfast before. Back when they lived together, he used to leap up, tail wagging wildly, bounding toward his bowl before the food even touched the dish. But now he only blinked up at his master, his body too weak, his spirit too worn down to show excitement. The man's chest tightened as he stood and walked toward the kitchen. He rummaged through the cabinets, hands shaking slightly as he pulled out a can of wet dog food he had bought the night before. He scooped the food into a bowl, placed it gently on the floor, then stepped back. The dog didn't move. A few long seconds passed before he slowly, carefully, lifted his head. He glanced at the food as if unsure whether it was meant for him, then flicked his gaze toward the door again. The man clenched his jaw. He wasn't eating. The weight of that realization crushed him. He dropped to his knees beside the dog, his hands gentle but urgent as he stroked his fur. "You have to eat," he whispered. "Please, boy, you have to get stronger." The dog only rested his chin on his paws. His golden eyes, once so full of warmth and life, had dulled. A knot formed in the man's throat. He had spent 4 years longing to be reunited with his best friend, and now that they were here, it wasn't enough. The dog wasn't just weak. He was broken. 4 years of waiting had stolen something from him. The will to hope. The will to live. The man gritted his teeth and carefully lifted the food bowl, bringing it closer. "Come on, just a little," he coaxed. "You're home now. You're safe." The dog sniffed the food, but didn't take a bite. The man ran a shaking hand through his hair, his vision blurring. How had he let this happen? How had he left him for so long that the dog had forgotten how to want? Tears burned at the edges of his eyes. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead to the floor beside his dog, shoulders trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have come back. I should have—" He cut himself off, the words catching in his throat. Sorry wasn't enough. Sorry wouldn't undo the years of suffering, the countless nights spent alone in the freezing cold, the endless days of waiting for someone who never returned. The dog had been faithful, and he had failed him. A small, warm nose nudged against his hand. The man gasped softly, lifting his head. The dog had inched closer, his eyes searching, uncertain. His body was still weak, still frail, but for the first time, there was something else in his expression. Not hope, not yet, but recognition. The man swallowed hard and gently cupped the dog's face. "You're still in there, aren't you?" he whispered. "You're still my boy." A pause. Then, ever so faintly, the dog's tail gave a single, slow wag. It was the smallest motion, barely even noticeable. But it was something. The man exhaled shakily, his throat tight. He sat up straighter, bracing himself. "All right," he murmured. "We're going to fix this. Together." That night, he set up a small sleeping space closer to the couch, hoping his presence would bring the dog some comfort. But when he woke in the middle of the night, he found him sitting by the door, staring at it. Still waiting, still caught in the past. The man clenched his fists. He had to do something. The next morning, he made a decision. He took the dog to the vet. The clinic was warm and smelled of antiseptic. A young woman in blue scrubs, with kind eyes and dark hair pulled into a ponytail, examined the frail animal. She frowned as she gently ran her hands along the dog's thin frame. "He's malnourished," she murmured. "And dehydrated. You said he hasn't eaten?" The man shook his head, his jaw tightening. "He won't touch anything. I've tried." The vet sighed, her eyes filled with sympathy. "It's not uncommon," she said gently. "Some dogs who go through extreme trauma lose their appetite. It's like they shut down." The word struck the man like a punch to the gut. Shut down. His dog, his best friend, had spent so many years waiting for him that now that he was finally here, he didn't know how to be anymore. The vet continued. "We'll run some tests, make sure there's nothing else going on. But the most important thing is patience. He's been surviving for so long that he doesn't know how to do anything else." The man ran a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping into his bones. "What do I do?" he whispered. She smiled softly. "You remind him why he's alive." The words echoed in his mind as he took his dog home. That night, he didn't let him sleep by the door. He coaxed him onto the couch beside him, resting a careful hand over his thin body. He didn't let him wait alone. He stayed. As the city lights flickered outside, as the stars moved through the sky, the man whispered stories of their past, of running through fields, of warm summer afternoons, of a time when life was simple and whole. And slowly, bit by bit, the dog listened. Healing wouldn't come overnight, but love was patient, and the man would wait, just as his dog had waited for him, because some souls are meant to find each other, again and again, until the waiting is over. The night was quiet, save for the faint hum of the city outside. The dog lay curled on the couch, his body still tense but no longer trembling. The man sat beside him, one hand resting gently on his back, feeling the frail rise and fall of each breath. He had spent the last hour whispering old stories, recounting the days when his dog had been young, when the world had been whole. He spoke of long walks, of sun-drenched fields, of the warmth of home before it all fell apart. The dog did not react much, but he was listening. The man could feel it. And then, for the first time in 4 years, something changed. The dog let out a quiet sigh, deep and slow. His muscles, so used to tension, finally released. His body sank into the couch and his eyes fluttered closed. Not in exhaustion, not in resignation, but in trust. The man swallowed hard. He had been waiting for this moment. Not for the dog to run to him with excitement. Not yet. That would take time. But for this, for the first sign that maybe, just maybe, his dog was beginning to believe in life again. That night, for the first time since bringing him home, the dog did not sit by the door. He slept. Morning came with the soft golden glow of sunlight filtering through the curtains. The man stirred, feeling warmth pressed against his side. It took him a moment to realize what had happened. His dog had moved closer to him in the night. Not far, not much, but enough. Enough to tell him that something inside his best friend was beginning to thaw. A small, trembling smile broke across his lips. Maybe things could be okay again. Maybe love could fix what time had broken. He ran his fingers gently through the dog's fur, careful not to startle him. His heart swelled at the sight of the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. Then, something incredible happened. The dog's tail twitched, a small motion, a hesitant one. But it was there. The man let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You're still in there," he whispered. "I knew it." He stood carefully, not wanting to disturb him. He moved toward the kitchen, preparing the same meal as yesterday, wet food, fresh water. When he placed the bowl down this time, something was different. The dog lifted his head. His golden eyes flicked to the bowl, then to the man. There was hesitation. Years of habit could not be erased in a single night. But then, with the same slowness he had moved closer on the couch, the dog stood. It was unsteady. His legs, weak from years of surviving on scraps, wobbled slightly. But he made his way forward, step by step, until his nose hovered just over the food. The man held his breath. Then, finally, his dog ate. A choked laugh escaped him, and he wiped at his eyes before any tears could fall. "Good boy," he murmured. "That's my good boy." It wasn't much, but it was enough. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm of healing. The dog grew stronger, little by little. His appetite returned, and though he was still wary, still unsure of his place in this new world, he no longer sat by the door. He had stopped waiting. One evening, as the man sat on the couch, the dog did something that nearly broke him. He climbed onto the couch beside him. Not close, not pressing into him as he once had in their past life, but near enough. Near enough to say something without words. "I am trying." The man's chest ached with emotion. He reached out, hand hovering for a moment before finally settling against the dog's fur. His tail gave another slow wag. The past wasn't fully behind them. It couldn't be, but they were getting there. Then, just as hope had begun to settle, the world shifted again. It happened late one afternoon. The man had decided to take his dog outside for the first time. He didn't go far, just to the small courtyard outside the apartment complex. It was quiet, enclosed, safe. He had been cautious, moving slowly, letting his dog sniff at the grass, feel the warmth of the sun. At first, it seemed fine. The dog took a few steps forward, testing the unfamiliar sensation of solid ground beneath his paws. He glanced back at his master, unsure, but there was no fear in his eyes, only hesitation. The man crouched a few feet away, offering a quiet encouragement. "You're doing good, buddy. Just take your time." The dog exhaled slowly, his ears twitching as he turned his gaze toward the sky. Then, somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew. The sound echoed, sharp and piercing, and something inside the dog snapped. He froze. His body locked up, muscles rigid, eyes wide. His breathing turned shallow, frantic. The man's stomach dropped. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." But it was too late. The sound had transported the dog back to another place, another time, to the station, to the years of waiting, of loneliness, of heartbreak. He spun, his body moving on instinct, darting toward the exit of the courtyard. The man lunged. "Stop!" But the dog didn't hear him. He only heard the sound of the train, the memory of the place where he had waited for so long. The man's fingers barely brushed against his fur before he slipped past. For the first time in weeks, the dog ran. Not toward home, not toward safety, but toward the past, toward the station. The man didn't think, didn't hesitate. He took off after him, his legs burning, his heart hammering. The streets blurred, people turned, startled, as a man in a frenzy chased after a thin golden dog. "Stop, please!" But the dog was fast, fueled by something deeper than instinct, by memory, by the only thing he had known for years. The station was calling him back, and he was answering. The man's chest ached as he pushed himself harder, dodging through crowds, ignoring the honking of cars, the frantic voices of strangers. He couldn't lose him again. Not now. Not after everything. Then, up ahead, he saw it. The familiar outline of the train station, the same platform where the dog had waited for years, and his dog, his best friend, was running straight for it. A train rumbled in the distance. The man's blood turned to ice. He forced his legs to move faster, faster, faster. The train's whistle screamed through the air. The dog was just feet away from the tracks. The man dove. His hands caught fur, and everything went black. The world was a blur of motion and noise. The deafening wail of the train, the gasps of onlookers, the cold pavement slamming into his ribs as he hit the ground. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then, pain. A sharp, searing ache pulsed through his shoulder where he had landed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight beneath his arms shifted, and panic shot through him like lightning. The dog. His arms tightened instinctively around the frail body beneath him, shielding him from whatever impact had come next. He could still feel the rapid thud of a heartbeat against his chest, but he didn't dare move. The train roared past, its force rattling the station platform, sending gusts of wind whipping around them. He squeezed his eyes shut, his mind a storm of terror. He had caught him, just barely. The train had missed them, just barely. He gasped for breath, his entire body trembling. A hand gripped his shoulder. "Sir, are you okay?" The voice was distant, muffled against the ringing in his ears. Slowly, he forced his eyes open. The first thing he saw was the dog, sprawled beneath him, his golden fur splayed across the pavement. His ribs rose and fell in frantic, shallow breaths, his legs twitching as if he were still trying to run. The man's stomach twisted. What had he done? What had he almost lost? Carefully, he loosened his grip, shifting onto his knees as the train finally thundered away in the distance. The dog didn't move. A choked sound escaped his throat. "Buddy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Come on, look at me." The dog's ears flicked at the familiar voice. Slowly, hesitantly, his golden eyes lifted to meet his master's. The fear in them shattered something deep inside the man's soul. For years, he had imagined this reunion, but not like this. Not with his dog trembling in terror beneath him, his frail body still trying to escape back to a place of sorrow and waiting. A bitter taste rose in his throat. The train station had been his prison, but it had also been his home, his only home, and in his desperation to fix things, to bring his dog back to the world he had once known, the man had forgotten. He had never truly left that place behind. Not in his heart. Not in his soul. The waiting had changed him, and it had changed his dog, too. The man felt the burn of fresh tears in his eyes, his fingers shaking as he stroked the dog's head. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he whispered. But the words felt hollow. Because wasn't that the very thing the dog had believed, once before? Hadn't he believed that waiting would bring him home? And now, wasn't the man asking him to believe again, but in something new, something different, something even harder? A sharp gust of wind cut through the station, stinging his skin, but he barely felt it. All he felt was the weight of his failure. He had come back, but he had not undone the past. The past was alive in both of them, breathing in the space between each heartbeat. The man swallowed hard and lowered his head, his forehead resting against the dog's frail body. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The dog let out a slow, trembling breath. Then, something soft, something barely there, a warm, wet nose nudged against his arm. The man lifted his head. The dog was looking at him now, really looking at him. His golden eyes were still clouded with fear, but something else flickered beneath the surface. Recognition, a fragile, quiet understanding, and maybe, just maybe, acceptance. The man exhaled, his breath shaky as he slid his arms carefully beneath the dog's frail frame. "Let's go home," he murmured. This time, the dog didn't resist. He let himself be carried away from the station, away from the place where he had spent years waiting. But as the man stepped onto the street, as he hailed a cab with his dog still cradled in his arms, He knew this wasn't over. This wasn't fixed. This wasn't something that could be mended with love alone. His dog had waited for him. Now it was his turn to wait, to be patient, to help him learn that life was not just waiting. Not anymore. The apartment felt different when they returned. Maybe it was the way the dog hesitated at the threshold, his paws lingering on the edge of the doorway as if uncertain he truly belonged inside. Maybe it was the way the man's hands trembled slightly as he set him down on the couch, as if afraid that the moment he let go, the dog would disappear like a ghost from the past. Or maybe it was just the weight of what had almost happened. The man sat beside him, exhausted, pressing the heels of his palms against his eyes. His body still ached from the fall, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was the frail creature curled beside him, eyes heavy with exhaustion. His dog was safe. He was safe. And yet, the man could not shake the fear that had settled deep in his bones. One sound, just one sound, had been enough to break everything, to send the dog running, to bring him back to the place where he had lost himself. What if it happened again? What if, no matter how much love he gave, no matter how much patience he had, the waiting could never truly leave the dog's heart? What if he had come back too late? The thought nearly crushed him. He let out a slow, shuddering breath and turned to look at his dog. The thin frame rose and fell with each quiet breath. His fur was still rough, his body still too weak, but there was something there now, something that hadn't been there before. Not peace, not yet, but tiredness. The kind of tiredness that came from carrying too much, for too long. The kind of tiredness that, just maybe, was finally ready to be put down. The man reached out and gently ran his fingers through his fur. "I won't let you go," he whispered. The dog did not move, but as the man continued to stroke his fur, a slow, hesitant sound filled the quiet space between them. A sigh, not of fear, not of pain, but of surrender. A small, quiet surrender to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to wait anymore. The man closed his eyes, pressing a shaking hand against his chest. He would wait, no matter how long it took, because love was not measured in time. It was measured in staying, and this time he would stay. The city breathed in the quiet of the late night, a mosaic of golden lights flickering against the dark sky. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of a train whistle lingered, but tonight it was nothing more than a whisper, a distant memory. The man sat on the balcony, his back against the cool metal railing, his fingers absently running through his dog's fur. The dog lay beside him, his frail body pressed close, the warmth of him steady and real. It had been weeks now since they had found each other again. Weeks of slow, patient steps. Weeks of relearning trust. Weeks of waiting for something neither of them could name. The past still lived in his dog's eyes, in the way his body tensed at sudden sounds, in the way he sometimes looked toward the door as if he wasn't sure he was meant to be here. But there were changes, too. The flinches had grown fewer, the restless nights had turned quieter, and sometimes, just sometimes, his tail would give the faintest wag when the man spoke to him. It wasn't much, but it was something, and after 4 long years of waiting, something was more than enough. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of damp pavement, of distant rain. The dog lifted his head, his nose twitching at the air, ears perked in quiet curiosity. The man smiled. It was the little things that told him his dog was still in there, still willing to live, still willing to try. And tonight felt different. There was something in the air, something unspoken between them, a moment waiting to unfold. The man exhaled slowly, his chest tight, his throat thick with unspoken words. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think I'd never get this chance." The dog didn't react, but he didn't turn away either. "I thought, maybe I'd lost you for good," the man admitted, "that maybe I'd come back too late." His fingers tightened slightly in the dog's fur, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But you waited for me." He swallowed hard, his heart aching with the weight of it. You waited. The dog blinked, his golden eyes flickering with something quiet, something deep. The man smiled, though his eyes burned. I won't let you wait alone again. The dog let out a slow breath, and then, before the man could say another word, he did something that stopped his heart. He shifted and laid his head on his master's lap. The man's breath caught. He didn't move, didn't dare breathe too hard, afraid that any sudden motion would break whatever fragile trust had just been given to him. The weight of the dog's head, warm, solid, real, felt like the closing of an old wound, like an answer to a question that had been lingering for years. The man closed his eyes, exhaling a shaky breath. "Good boy," he whispered, and for the first time in 4 years, the words felt whole again. They sat like that for a long time, the city moving around them, the past settling into something softer, something no longer sharp, something almost forgiven. Maybe they weren't healed yet, maybe they never would be, but they had each other, and that was enough. For now, that was enough. The night stretched long and quiet, the hum of the city fading into a lullaby of distant sounds. The dog lay curled beside his master, his breaths deep and steady. The past no longer weighed so heavily on him. The waiting, the loneliness, the fear. It was still there, a shadow at the edges of his soul, but it no longer defined him. For the first time in years, he was not waiting. For the first time in years, he was home. The man ran his fingers gently through his fur, lost in thought. He had spent so long trying to fix things, trying to undo the damage time had carved into both of them. But maybe some things didn't need fixing. Maybe they just needed time. The dog stirred, shifting slightly against his side. The movement was slow, deliberate, and then, without hesitation, his tail wagged, not hesitant, not unsure, a full, slow, real wag. The man's breath hitched, his fingers stilling against the dog's fur. It was small. It was everything. Tears burned behind his eyes, but he let them fall. He had waited for this moment, for proof that his dog had not just come back to him, but that he had chosen to stay, that he had found something worth staying for. The man wiped at his face, laughing softly. "You're gonna be okay," he whispered. "We both are." The dog let out a soft, content sigh. And for the first time in 4 years, the world felt whole again. The past had been heavy, but the future was theirs. Together, at last. The night had passed in quiet stillness, the kind that settled into the bones, wrapping itself around the edges of things long left unsaid. The city outside continued its restless hum, but inside the apartment there was peace, fragile, yet real. The man woke with the first streaks of dawn painting the sky, his body sore from sleeping on the couch. His hand was still resting in the soft fur of his dog, who lay curled beside him, his breaths slow and steady. For the first time in 4 years, they had made it through a night without the weight of waiting pressing between them. The past had not disappeared. It lingered, a ghost of what had been lost. But now, it no longer held them captive. The dog stirred as the light shifted, his golden eyes flickering open, groggy but aware. He blinked up at his master, something quiet and soft passing between them. The man smiled. "Morning, buddy." The dog didn't move at first, just let out a long breath, as if testing the air. And then, slowly, carefully, he stretched. Not hesitantly, not cautiously, but like a dog who had finally begun to understand that he was safe. The man swallowed the lump in his throat, watching as his dog pushed himself to his feet, shaking out his fur. He moved toward the door, not to leave, not to escape, but to stand there, looking back at his master with expectation in his eyes. The man sat up. "You want to go outside?" For a second, The dog just watched him. Then, his tail gave a slow, deliberate wag. The man exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It had been weeks since he had brought his dog home, weeks of slow steps and careful trust. He had never forced him outside, never made him confront the world before he was ready. And now, here they were. It wasn't the same as before. The dog wasn't bounding toward the door, eager for adventure. But he was choosing to step outside, and that made all the difference. The man stood, his movements slow and easy. He grabbed the leash, the same one that had been left hanging by the door all these years, and knelt beside his dog. "All right," he murmured. "Let's take it slow." The dog didn't flinch as the collar was clipped around his neck, didn't hesitate when the door swung open. He took the first step on his own. The morning air was crisp, the scent of damp earth lingering after the night's brief rain. The city was waking, the streets not yet crowded, the world still painted in the soft glow of dawn. The man kept a loose hold on the leash, letting his dog set the pace. He didn't rush, didn't urge him forward. This had to be his choice. The dog moved slowly, his nose twitching at the scents carried on the breeze. He hesitated at the first street corner, his body stiffening slightly at the distant sound of tires on pavement. The man stopped beside him. "It's okay, buddy." The dog turned his head, golden eyes searching his master's face. Then, he stepped forward. Not much, just a single paw onto the new sidewalk. But it was enough. The man smiled, his chest aching in the best way. They walked in silence, side by side, past a shadow that no longer held them in place. At the end of the street, the man hesitated. He hadn't meant to come this way, hadn't meant to bring them here. But maybe it was time. The dog sniffed the air, his ears flicking as he caught something familiar. He turned his head. And there it was. The train station. The place where he had spent 4 years waiting. The place where time had stood still. The man's breath hitched, his fingers tightening on the leash. Would his dog try to return? Would he fall back into old habits, believing he still had something to wait for? The dog stared. He didn't move, didn't pull forward, didn't turn away either. He simply looked. For a long moment, the man stood frozen, afraid to break whatever spell had settled over them. Then, the dog sighed, a deep, slow breath, as if releasing something heavy, and he turned away. The man's heart clenched. This was it. This was the moment he had been afraid of, terrified that his dog would still long for the past, for the place where he had been left behind. But he didn't. The dog had made his choice. And for the first time since their reunion, the man truly believed they were going to be okay. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "All right, buddy," he said, his voice thick. "Let's go home." The dog wagged his tail, and they walked away from the station, together. That night, as they sat on the balcony, the city stretching before them, the man reached down and scratched his dog behind the ears. "You did good today," he murmured. The dog closed his eyes, his tail thumping softly against the floor. The man smiled. The past had not disappeared, but the future was wide open, and for the first time, they were ready for it. Together. The apartment was quiet, bathed in the soft golden glow of morning. Sunlight filtered through the half-open curtains, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The air smelled of fresh coffee and the faint lingering scent of rain from the night before. The man sat at the kitchen table, fingers curled around a warm mug, watching his dog. He was still curled on the couch, his chest rising and falling in deep, steady breaths. But something was different now. He no longer twitched in his sleep, no longer whimpered as if lost in dreams of waiting. His body was loose, relaxed, fully at rest. The man exhaled, the sound almost like a quiet laugh. It was such a simple thing, and yet it felt like the biggest victory in the world. He had spent weeks wondering if they would ever get here, if his dog would ever truly believe he was home. And now, looking at him, he knew. The waiting was over. The past no longer owned them. They had made it. He took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth seep into his bones. The morning stretched ahead of them, open and quiet, filled with nothing but possibility. It had been a long time since he had felt that way, since he had looked at a new day and seen promise instead of regret. The dog stirred, his ears twitching, his golden eyes blinking open. He lifted his head, blinking at his master before letting out a long, contented sigh. The man smiled. "Morning, buddy." The dog stretched, his tail giving a lazy thump against the cushion. No hesitation, no fear, just trust, just home. Later that morning, they went for a walk. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The man kept the leash loose in his grip, letting his dog take the lead. The streets felt different now, as if the city itself had shifted somehow. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of blooming flowers from the small garden down the block. The distant hum of life surrounded them. Cars rolling by, people murmuring, laughter spilling from an open cafe. And for the first time in years, the sound of a train whistle didn't send a shock of fear through the dog's body. He lifted his head, ears tilting toward the sound, then simply kept walking. The man let out a breath of quiet relief. They had won. Not in a grand, dramatic way, but in this, in the small steps, in the way his dog no longer searched for something that was no longer there, in the way they walked together, side by side, without hesitation. They passed the old station, and this time, the dog didn't even glance at it. The past had finally let them go, and they had let it go too. That evening, as they sat on the balcony, the city stretching out before them, the man found himself thinking about all the things they had lost. 4 years apart. 4 years of silence. 4 years of waiting for something neither of them understood. But tonight, for the first time, he didn't feel regret, because in the end, they had found their way back. It didn't matter how long it had taken. All that mattered was now. The dog let out a quiet sigh, curling closer against his master's side. The man smiled, running a hand through his fur. "We made it," he murmured. The dog's tail gave a slow, steady wag. They sat there in silence, watching the city breathe, feeling the weight of time finally lift. The past was behind them, the future was open, and for the first time in years, they were exactly where they were meant to be. Together. At last. Some bonds are unbreakable. No matter how much time passes, no matter how deep the distance, love always finds its way back. This story isn't just about a dog's loyalty, it's about patience, healing, and second chances. Have you ever experienced a moment when love stood the test of time? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more stories that remind us what truly matters. Because sometimes, the ones who wait for us the longest are the ones who love us the most.